Welcome back on your Friday morning. We are on verdict watch right now as the jury in the Lindsay Clancy case resumes deliberations this morning. In fact, it's happening right now. Clancy, a former labor and delivery nurse, is accused of killing her 3 children back in 2023. So this is a live look for you outside the courthouse this morning. Now, her defense argues she was suffering from postpartum psychosis and hearing voices at the time. The case has drawn national attention, honestly international at this point. It is all over social media, and it's sparking a broader conversation about postpartum psychosis, about mental health, treatment, and criminal responsibility. Jurors may also consider a lesser manslaughter charge. We've got Emily Akita on the story for us.
Their mom is the one that's killing them. That's extreme atrocity and cruelty.
The former labor and delivery nurse seemed emotional in closing arguments as the prosecution described in disturbing detail how Clancy strangled Cora, Dawson, and Callan in 2023 before attempting to kill herself.
Those kids were her protective factor. Those kids were keeping her from ending her misery. And so she had to remove the protective factor.
Prosecutors alleging her actions were deliberate, intentionally sending her husband out for errands before the killings and afterwards asking for an attorney in the hospital.
Still with a tube in her throat, she's asking, do I have a lawyer?
But Clancy's defense telling jurors she's not criminally responsible.
She was a nurse, a daughter, a wife, and a darn good mother.
The defense arguing she was in the throes of postpartum psychosis and says she heard a voice.
How does this turn into this? How? Because of the damn medicine and the lousy medical care that she got.
Detailing the more than a dozen medications she was prescribed,
Lorazepam, sertraline,
and alleged inadequate care despite her pleas for help. A case driving protests on both sides and thrusting maternal health into the spotlight.
That was our Emily Akita reporting there. So joining us this morning is criminal defense attorney Adam Ashby with Jackson White Law Firm. You know, Adam, this case is it's everywhere. It's all anyone can talk about. And I feel like especially for women, because as mothers, we can't even imagine. It's just so horrifically tragic what has happened here. How do you think, now that it's in the hands of the jury, how do you think the prosecution did with this case? Did they present enough information to get the outcome that they're hoping for?
Yeah, 10,000-foot view, hindsight 2020, fourth quarter quarterback. All of those things are really easy, right? When you're watching it on social media,
Yes.
You're only seeing tidbits. You're not seeing the 5 years prior of pre-litigation of all of those things. There's a lot of things that I can nitpick about what the prosecution did, and I can also nitpick about the defense. In the early stages, I felt like the prosecution focused a lot on that the mental health was just not true and that it shouldn't be focused on and that this is all really coincidental and that she wasn't suffering from anything. But in the closing statements, they conceded the fact that she suffered from severe mental illness, right? They conceded the fact that, yeah, this is something that she suffered from for a long time, sought a lot of treatment, but the prosecution kind of switched their tone and said, but she had treatment. She had the facilities, she had the help, she had the care and the facilities and everything at her beck and call, really, which is more than what most people have and what most people are able to experience. And so that shouldn't alleviate her from all criminal responsibility. So they kind of switch their tone a little bit.
And I find that very interesting because what the defense is saying is that, listen, she admitted to doing this, but postpartum psychosis as a defense mechanism going in and leaning towards a psychosis, how does that work? When you present that to the jury, what do you need them to understand about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to point out that there's 9 women on the jury,
yes,
3 men.
Right.
That's a huge point. And I think the defense is brilliant for really leaning in on this because what I've experienced in my practice is that severe mental illness is not something new, right? We have the Lori Vallow case who clearly suffered from severe mental illness, but The public doesn't seem to have much sympathy for that type of mental illness.
No.
The public doesn't seem to have much sympathy for a PTSD war veteran who goes on a meth binge and kills kids. But this seems to strike a different chord, and maybe it's because there's millions of women who can sympathize with what she's gone through. Now, the difference, or I guess not the difference, but the hard decision that the jury has to come to is say, okay, we acknowledge the mental illness, we acknowledge the difficulty that she went through. Does that alleviate her from any criminal responsibility?
Right. So how do you come up with an answer in this trial? They're considering, well, manslaughter, which is a lesser charge.
Second-degree murder as well.
Second-degree and first-degree murder.
Correct.
In your eyes, right now the jury is deliberating. What are those deliberations like?
Yeah, I think the biggest deliberation, and they have to remember that their jury instructions include, you don't penalize her. You look at the law and you see if what the evidence was presented only in the trial applies to the law. And if it hits the law and it meets every element, then you find her guilty of that charge. They don't get to determine what her penalty will be. They don't get to say, oh, well, it's not fair that she's going to serve life in prison or 20 years or in a mental hospital. They don't get to discuss that. Or at least they have to push that aside. They have to look at the elements of the law, see the evidence that was presented, and if they match, then they have to find her guilty.
Everyone is watching this trial. Everyone is waiting for some end to it. How long do you expect something like this to take? And man, this would be a landmark case. You know, if postpartum psychosis is something that she can claim that I just cannot be responsible for my actions.
From a citizen's perspective, it's terrifying. From a criminal defense perspective, it's also terrifying because if every mental illness alleviates you from any criminal responsibility, how do we open the floodgates to where we say, oh, you suffered from severe mental illness, it's documented with medicine, with doctor treatment, with everything, not responsible.
Yeah, you're free.
That is a really terrifying perspective, but it's also terrifying to conclude or to at least have the perception that mental illness doesn't play a factor in someone's consequences or in their actions. We need to have both sides of that scale and say it shouldn't eliminate all responsibility, but at the same time, it needs to be considered. It needs to be studied. We need to have more conversations about it for sure.
Well, and I think as a woman, that's part of the frustration here with this trial specifically, because there is not a lot of study or help for postpartum mothers.
Absolutely.
All right, Adam, thank you so much for your insight every single time, man. I'm just so thankful for everything that you have and how you can really break down these cases and help us all understand what exactly is going on.
Yeah, this is a complicated one. It's not going to be easy for the jury to really come down and lock in on something. I think this is going to be a longer deliberation than what people really want.
All right, we'll have to see. Adam, thank you so much.